is an interesting question, and a question that you really can't answer without going back first and focusing on the fact that the deity of Jesus is a central pillar of Christianity. Without the deity of Christ, you really don't have Christianity. So how can such a stupendous claim to deity be justified? Wouldn't Christianity be better off with just an ethical system instead of a belief in a divine man on earth? A lot of people have thought that, but as you look at the evidence, you find that Jesus made the claims himself to deity, claims that really can't be interpreted any other way than a claim to a divine personhood. Consequently, we are forced into a position of recognizing that he's telling us the truth, in which case he is God, or he's lying to us, which completely destroys his credibility, or he was mentally imbalanced, a psychological imbalanced person. The last two options, a psychological imbalance or a liar, just aren't plausible when you look at all of the evidence of the kind of person Jesus was, which forces us back onto the conclusion he was telling us the truth. Now, of course, we freely admit as Christians that this is a mystery. The idea that someone could be at one and the same time truly man and truly God defies logic. It isn't something that can be explained logically. Now, it is true that there is at least an analogy in the physical world. Light, for example, is said by the physicists to demonstrate the properties of both particles and waves, both at the same time. So this is referred to as a duality by the physicists, so that at least an analogy is there for how something can, at one and the same time, be two different things. And I think this is a reasonable comparison to the deity and humanity of Jesus at one and the same time. It isn't explicable logically. It is a mystery. We completely affirm that. But it is a mystery that is true. That's a central issue. Why would God become man? Now, it's true there are prophecies in the Old Testament about a Messiah coming to reveal God to man, to perform a work of deliverance for Israel. But to find a reason why God would become man requires that we look not only at what God has done, but at what man needs. And the thing that we find when we really look at mankind is he's caught in sin and suffering. And it is for that reason that God became man, to redeem man from his plight, from his trapped position in sin and suffering. So if God would go to such extraordinary lengths as to become incarnate, to become man, what that really means is that the Creator entered into his own creation. A remarkable thought. But if he loved his creation, that provided the motivation for him to do that. And yet, to become man means he had to be, his deity had to be veiled. That is to say, to some degree, hidden. So that Jesus, as a man, became hungry, he became tired, he could be beaten, he could be killed. In all those things, he demonstrated humanity. And yet, he also demonstrated his deity in acts of power, in his goodness, and ultimately in his death on the cross and his resurrection. All affirmed that he was not just a man, but he was also God. Well, if this was something that God actually did in history, that is, becoming incarnate in the person Jesus of Nazareth, he veiled his deity, which means he voluntarily accepted many of the limitations of humanity. And that's what we see in his admission that only the Father knew the time of the end of the world. That was within the period of time in which he voluntarily accepted limitations on his deity. But that does not mean that he ceased being God. God can never cease to be God. If he's God, he will always be God. Now, this limitations on the expression of his deity were removed when he was resurrected from the dead. Jesus is just as, or is exactly as omniscient as the Father. Each member of the Godhead knows all things, including Jesus, as the resurrected one, which is different than Jesus as the incarnate one on earth in space-time history.